Welcome, David, to the Life After Loss podcast. And we are really honoured that you've joined us to share your wisdom with Australian audiences around grief and loss. You're revered around the world by academics and therapists for your research and theories on grief. And in particular, your work stemmed from the work that you did with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages of grief. But you're equally loved by, real world people. They've got a lived experience of grief and loss. And across your whole body of work, you've touched on all types of losses. And that's what we've been finding in our work with the victims of natural disasters on this podcast. So I guess I wanted to know a little bit about your understanding about the breadth of grief and loss that might come out of natural disasters.
It's interesting. You realize, and thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here with everyone. You realize grief is such a small word for such a large number of things that fall under the umbrella of grief. There's so many deaths, so many disasters, so many different kinds of endings and tragedies that happen in the world. And they're all, they all create grief. They all create I often think of grief as a change we did not want. So many things do happen in the world that we don't want, all these different kind of disasters. And I think we're trying to figure out how to manage in the world. In the past few years, boy, has grief come to the forefront and come to our vocabulary. Um, I talked a lot this last couple of years about micro and macro griefs. In other words, the big and little griefs. And that's not to minimize any of the little ones. I always say when people want to know which grief is the worst, I always say yours.
And I actually have also heard you talk about grief as a pie in terms of, because there is a lot of comparison around grief. And I have heard you refer to it as a pie that there's always going to be another slice left in the pie. And I think that's something that's really being felt by a lot of the victims of natural disasters and bushfires. For those people that perhaps haven't lost as much, and yet are still feeling this extreme grief response.
Right.
And then the comparison between people as, oh, I lost a home and I lost my livelihood, where you've lost, nothing. What would you say to the people that are experiencing that perhaps have got that disenfranchised grief where they really haven't lost anything tangible?
Or have they? The thing is, I talked about this, that it came up rather naturally in March of 2020. Many of your listeners know not only have I done work in this area, but I had my own losses as a child of my mother and being in a shooting. And then as an adult 5 years ago, my younger son died, David. So as 2020 hit, I was taking a walk outside on my street where I live with a friend of mine, and a young woman came up to us crying, saying, "Don't you do something in grief?" And she was in so many tears around, she had had her wedding postponed. And I talked to her about her dreams being shattered and her grief and her loss and her pain. And after we were done, she thanked me and walked back to her place. And my friend said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe she was going on and on about a wedding postponed when your son has died." And I said, grief is not like a pie. It isn't like she took a piece and now there's less for me. That is the wedding she was dreaming about, is her worst loss at 20 years old. It's not her place to feel my loss. It's her place to feel her loss. And I think, and it's not, a sum total that she takes some and there's less for you and I. I mean, unfortunately, there's so much pain in the world to go around that we don't, it's not like the more people, the less pain, unfortunately. So I think that's so important to think about whatever pain you're feeling, whatever your loss you're feeling, it's your job to feel it and not compare it. Many times we think about comparing, and the problem with comparing is if you win, you lose. And, we're not talking about having a broken mind here. We're talking about having a broken heart. And your heart can be broken through a death, through a relationship ending, through a home being destroyed, through part of nature that you loved being destroyed. I mean, so many things can be those changes we didn't want.
Yeah, absolutely. And our hearts do go out to you for the loss of your son, David.
Thank
We wanted to we wanted to speak to you about this, I guess, with the people that have experienced this the climate grief that we've seen. There seems to be a complete loss of hope, and what seems to be getting these people through on the day to day is this finding of some kind of meaning, and it really has come to the fore, particularly with the climate grief survivors that we're talking to. And I know that your new book, Finding Meaning: The Sixth Stage of Grief, is really all about that finding meaning. So, can you tell us a little bit about how that works for people that are recovering or adapting to grief?
Sure. As you kindly mentioned in the beginning, my work with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, adapting her iconic stages of death, 4 stages of grief, they were getting adapted rather poorly. And Elizabeth gave me the privilege of writing a book with her to adapt them formally. On Grief and Grieving was the book a few years ago, that we finished actually right before her death. And we made sure to really make sure everyone knew those stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. People knew they're not linear. There's no one right way to grieve, there's no one model to grieve. Grief can't be reduced to 5 easy steps. And the other thing that was a false assumption is that when you begin to wrestle with acceptance, it's the end of grief. And that's not true. Especially when someone dies. When someone says, how long are they going to grieve? I say, well, how long is the person going to be dead? If they're going to grieve for a long, if the person's going to be dead for a long time, you're going to grieve for a long time. That's just the reality of it. So, as we talk about that, after the death of my son, I was just in so much pain. And I thought about the concept of meaning and began reading about it. And obviously, I'd read Viktor Frankl's work. And I was so curious about, how do we find the light in the darkness? How do we find meaning? How do we keep hope alive? How do we do that when tragedy strikes? And so that's what really felt so powerful to me, is to find that meaning. Now, the confusing thing when people hear meaning is they think that meaning is in the horrible event, the tragedy, or the death. And they'll go, that death doesn't have any meaning. That tragedy doesn't have any meaning. And I'll go, correct. The meaning is not in the tragedy. The meaning is what we do after. It's what we do after. And so it's really about, whatever your loss is, to think about, what can you do after? That can take the form of, if a loved one's died, it can be the form of, I want to make sure no one else dies tragically like that. It can be something like, if the world is changing in ways you don't want it to, what can we still do to preserve this for generations to come? What can we do to make up for the ills of, our ancestors or other people who didn't care for our home, the planet, the relationship, whatever it may be?
Along with that comes with that grief comes a need for some sort of coping strategies, or for ways of coping with the suffering. And what would be your, I guess, some of the strategies that you would refer to in your work?
Well, I think one of the things I often talk about, pain from loss is inevitable, but suffering is optional. The pain of someone dying, the pain of COVID, the pain of things that happen in this world, I can't take those away. Especially when someone dies, pain is part of the love. However, suffering is what our mind does. Suffering is when our mind says, you're to blame, or you did this, or they died because you went to lunch, or it's pointless, or there's nothing you can do, or you've always done it wrong. Our mind, which you think would be so nice to us in grief, actually can be our worst critic. So, how can we begin to pay attention to the stories our mind makes up that doesn't serve us?
Yeah. Would there be some particular ways of dealing with that, of really tapping into your mind and tapping into your way of thinking? I guess I'm thinking around perhaps support, increasing your support and those sorts of things, which we've seen people do in the aftermath of natural disasters. And of course, you have your Facebook group and other support groups. So, can you tell us about the importance of support in grief work?
So I have, a Facebook group, as you kindly mentioned. I have an online group called Tender Hearts. Grief.com has so many resources for people. And here's the thing about it. You know, if your mind is telling you it's pointless, there's no hope, your family doesn't understand, your partner doesn't understand, it's pointless, there's no one out there for you, I might say to you one on one, yes, but it's not your fault, or there is people, or maybe talk to people who have had the same experience or one a little similar. No one's had exactly your experience. Find other grievers, find other people who believe in the same things as you. And you might say to me, yes, but you don't understand, David. There is no hope for me. And we're like, I'm trying to argue you through hope. There's something that happens in a group of people where you see one person going, it's pointless, no one understands. And then someone else goes, no, I actually understand a little bit of what you're saying. And people begin to support one another. And the interesting thing that happens is we find ourselves in each other's stories. When one person begins to heal, others begin to heal. And it's also fascinating to me what we find in the world of grief and grief support. People, one, don't want to take the time. They're afraid, like, if I start crying, I'll never stop. And I remind people, I've been doing this for decades. I've never been with a person who didn't stop crying. Start again, but but I understand the feeling of if I open that box, it will never end. And you begin to see that you can't heal what you don't feel. And that if you just allow those feelings, you'll feel them, they'll pass, you go to the next feeling. And you begin to see that in other people. And we're afraid to give grief time. And I tell people, grief doesn't need a lot of time, but it needs dedicated time. A walk, a shower, give grief a little time. And you also realize, I make a joke about I have a maintenance plan for the tires on my car in case something goes wrong or my tires need support. If they run over a nail, I'm taking care of my tires on my car. But yet, for me, I don't want to take the time and get support when something horrible happens in my life. I don't feel like I should either pay for help or pay for support. And it's like, of course you should. You want to get help for yourself.
I guess that's that sitting with that grief, and really and being prepared to go there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how that we talk about processing grief, but I guess a lot of people don't really understand what that means.
Processing is just feeling it, being a part of it, being organic with it. I tell people you come from a long line of dead people. Every ancestor you've had has had to deal with death. It's our society that's telling us You've only got 3 days. You should get over it. You should be past it by now. And people find that everyone's grief is unique. Even your grief is unique from your sibling's grief when a parent dies. It's so different for everyone.
And I wonder, with regards to that, the grief, or sitting with your grief. I know that I've read some of your sort of strategies for doing this, and they include a mindfulness, or perhaps continuing bonds in a way. I know that you've mentioned reaching out to the loved one and sending them love and compassion, which I thought was a really lovely strategy. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more on that.
Sure, there was a blip, a moment in psychology where it was thought, I wonder, when someone dies, do we end the relationship with them? And we realized very early on that's a mistake, that the truth is, I always say, don't give death any more power than it has. It already has the power to end someone's physical life, but it doesn't have the power to end our love, and it doesn't have the power to end our relationships. So, how can we have continuing bonds with our loved ones? And it's by continuing to love them. I mean, I love my son every day. I don't go, "He died, I have no more love for him." No, I love him every day. I send him love. I just went to my goddaughter's wedding, and when I made my toast, I included my son who had died, that I so know he would have loved to have been there. And a lot of times when I do trauma work with people, and I always say, all grief does not have trauma, but all trauma has grief. And some of the work is helping people get out of being stuck in that horrible traumatic moment that happened in the tragedy and bring them into the now. But then I'm like, don't leave your loved ones in the tragedy and the day they died either. We want to bring them out of it too and bring them into the now and have active, healthy relationships, with people who have died. And it doesn't mean I have some weird, crazy illusion that they're still alive, but I think about, oh, my son would have loved doing this, or I don't know how, but I hope he can see this through my eyes. And, I just sometimes they bring a smile to my face.
Oh, that's beautiful. And I guess another part of that is perhaps that legacy making, and honouring them in some with some form of legacy.
Yeah. And, one of the things I tell people about meaning is meaning doesn't have to be big. Meaning doesn't mean you're starting a charity. It can be, but it doesn't mean you have to start a charity or foundation. You and I are having a meaningful moment right now. Someone that you and I will never meet may hear a moment of this podcast, and it may touch them and help them. And that makes this meaningful to me. So part of it is naming just the meaningful moments. One woman, I was talking to her for a couple hours, and her child had died after 2 years. And she was telling me about her child and how it was completely meaningless, and there was never any meaning that could be found. And I said to her, I find hearing about your child today meaningful. I said, our conversation has been meaningful. I now know a little bit about your child, and they live on because of the stories you're telling. So even those things are meaningful in that way. But the legacies are not just the legacies, the huge one, oh, someone built a library, but what's the legacy we have when we leave the room? Do people go, oh my gosh, I love how David still talks about his son and keeps them alive, and he remembers his mother on New Year's and whatever it may be? Or do they go, wow, poor soul, he's not alive anymore? To really think about the big and the little legacies.
I really love that visual that you mentioned before of bringing that person out of that terrible situation in which they may have passed away, bringing them with you. And I
Yeah.
just think that's yeah, it's a really amazing visual.
We don't want them to die over and over again in our heads. It's horrible that a tragedy occurs once or a fire occurs once. We don't want to keep it going in our mind longer than it did in real life.
And I think that's something that a lot of people we've found are struggling with what we call prolonged grief. For example, one of the disasters that we're looking at is the Black Friday bushfires, which happened 12 years ago, and 173 people died in those fires. And there are people that are still struggling and with their grief and really who can't go there in terms of the moment that happened. I guess these people, a lot of these people feel like there's no hope for them, that they can't move past that grief. What would you say to that, David?
I understand why they're feeling that way, and I want to see their pain, and I want to hear about their pain, and I would love for them to share what they're going through and what still haunts them. That tells me that some of that pain hasn't been processed or hasn't been seen or hasn't been felt or has maybe been blocked by old wounds or circumstances or a culture that, says you were supposed to forget it. You didn't get to grieve it. I mean, I don't know the individual stories, obviously, but, life is possible after tragedy. I mean, I'm think I'm a living representative of that. But it's not easy and it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of support. And we can't be shutting people down. You shouldn't feel that way. You should be over it. The thing is, sometimes we look at people and we go, what's wrong with them? And it's not what's wrong with them, it's what happened to them, how it impacted them, and what they still need to heal and how they can get it.
And I think you touched on there the the fact that a lot of people have a compounding grief of sorts, things that have happened to them back in their childhood, and now perhaps are being triggered by this new disaster. And I wonder if I'm sure that you've worked with people that have experienced this sort of thing, and how you approach that.
Well, part of what that is we all have wounds from childhood. Childhood can be a challenging thing to go through. And some of those things get resolved and some don't, and they go on to challenge us in other ways. I think about two situations that just happened in my own life. That one, there was a woman in the local pharmacy who was asking for her medication, her antibiotics. And the pharmacy says, we don't have those, we don't stock them. That's an older antibiotic. We have newer ones. We'll call your doctor to get you a newer one today. And she goes, no, I need this antibiotic now, the one he said. And they said, look, we can have it tomorrow, or we can call your doctor and get you the newer one. And she burst into tears and said, don't you understand? I deserve my medication. Now, I looked at that from the outside and could say, someone was saying to her, green beans or broccoli, you pick. If you want green beans, we got to go to the store. We're not going to have it till tomorrow. There was never anything about whether she deserved it or not, but that's what her old wound was doing. Those are the kind of things that get in the way. It is that sense of there's no help for me out there. And so we have to go back and work with people to find out what happened in their childhood that there wasn't help for them, and have them see that now and process that as an adult, because you can understand how we might have gotten stuck there as a child.
And part of what we're wanting to do here with our podcast is all about what you call witnessing their grief. And we have heard from a lot of people that that's why they want to do this. That's why they want to talk on this podcast, is because they want their story to be told. How do you think witnessing someone's grief is very helpful?
We talk about are mirroring neurons in our brain and how babies need to be mirrored. And if you go on YouTube, you can see lots of videos of the mom smiling, the baby smiles back, the mom looks angry, the baby gets worried. Babies have mirroring neurons in their brain. We like to mirror one another, and we forget that stays with us in our adulthood. And we want to be seen. We want to be heard. We want our lives to matter. We want our loved ones' life and their death to matter. And so we want to know that we're being seen, and it's such an automatic process. I joke about I was walking down the street and a gentleman said to me, "Howdy," and I went, "Howdy back." I just howdy. I'm not someone who usually howdies someone, but he howdied me and I howdied him right back. That's our mirroring neurons. And yet, when something horrific happens, we want to tell the story. We want the story witnessed by another human being. We're not meant to be islands of grief.
Also, what we find in Australia is that there's not the way that we deal with grief. It's not well done here. Put it that way. People find it hard to talk to each other about it. There's a real stigma around grief and loss in Australia, and dying too. And I think that might be maybe the same or mirrored, or we may be mirroring you guys over there in America. But what would you say about that?
Well, I think we do have grief illiterate societies. Part of what changed is that, I'm teaching people what our great grandparents knew how to do. Our great grandparents knew how to be with the dying, they knew how to be with one another in grief. At a certain point, death moved from our homes into the hospitals. At a certain point, the body used to be at home, and that we used to have a parlor that moved to the funeral parlor. We don't have in our modern world an experience of death, dying, and grief. You want to see death, you go to the movies. You don't see it in your life until it happens to you. And that comes with a cost. So part of it is trying to understand that, a couple of things. If you look back decades ago, people would wear black for a year. And when we wore black for a year, after that year, many times the clergy would say to you, "It is time, if you choose, you do not have to, but if you choose, you can take the black off now and begin to live again." So we know that grief is not neat and it doesn't end exactly at a year, nor does grief ever end. But there's also, because those traditions were lost, there is no moment that we say your grief's going to be with you for the rest of your life. Hopefully, in time, you'll grieve with more love than pain. But it's also okay to begin living again. We don't have that moment that gets said to us. So we don't know when to grieve. We don't know when to live again. And a lot of the classes I teach are called Grieving Fully, Living Fully, because some people really have the grieving fully down, but not the living. And some people really have the living down, but they're denying the grief. What's our job? It's actually to do both, to grieve fully and to live fully.
What would you say about the importance of anniversaries someone that's grieving, and how we can help them at that time?
So, first of all, even the word bereaved comes from an old Latin word that means to be robbed. When something gets taken from you, we feel robbed. Anniversaries, I often say, are a return to the scene of the crime. Our bodies, our minds go, wow, the light's the same as it was a year ago. The temperature's the same. The month is the same. There's something about we're returning to that horrible moment. A whole cycle has happened. And now we're going to enter another year, but different now. without our loved one or the home or the situation that's changed. And so it brings up a response in us. Many times people are surprised that their anxiety and pain goes up before the anniversary. We think it's going to be a horrible day, that anniversary, but many times things start chugging up a little bit before. And to note that's normal to be so affected. Um, the fascinating thing I think about is how grief is in our body. One of the people that I work with and would do retreats with when we did the things in the physical world, and I actually did a tour with him in Australia, is Paul Denniston, who does grief yoga. And we talk about how grief also resides in our body. And one of the things that's interesting is like social workers and medical professionals and psychological professionals who work in adoption and in children's services would take a child and place them in foster care. And all one day they would get a call that the child was acting out. There was something problematic going on with the child. And the social worker would look them up and see it's actually an anniversary date. Even a child that was like 5 years old and doesn't even know what a calendar is somehow felt something in their body on the anniversary.
That's incredible, David. Wow. Do you think then that it's responsible for us to be releasing these episodes on the anniversary?
Yeah, I think it's naming that ritual and naming that pain and saying, this is not forgotten. What the impact everything had on your life is not forgotten, and you're valuable. And what you've been through is valuable, and what you've survived is valuable also.
And I guess I wanted to just probably finish off on this wonderful conversation. And I cannot thank you enough for all of your wisdom that you've imparted, and all of the analogies and the metaphors and everything. It's just also, I think it just resonates so deeply with people. And certainly your quote about grief being as unique as your fingerprint is something that we at Griefline, we really hold on to and speak that to people on the helpline, etc. I wanted to know people that may be listening and wanting to know how to get in touch with you, or how best to find out about your teachings and your body of knowledge. What's the best way for them to do that?
The best way is to visit grief.com, grief.com, but they can also, if they're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, to look up I am David Kessler. By the time I got to social media, someone already took David Kessler. So I had to be, I am David Kessler. They
Right.
can look it up, or my name in social media, and find my pages. I try to post really helpful things all the time. And, obviously the books are available at all the online retailers and physical bookstores. Please always support your local bookstore also. The books are there. And anyone who wants to take a look at the new book, Finding Meaning, my latest book, sixstage.com will also give them a free class when they get the book. So lots of resources to be found.
That's wonderful. And if I may just ask you one more thing, and this is really on behalf of the Griefline volunteers, because we are a volunteer run organisation, and without them, we wouldn't be here doing the work that we do every day. I wonder how you manage to, I guess, go through life and not be overwhelmed by working with in grief and by talking about grief so often. How do you not get overwhelmed by it?
I think becoming really clear that horrible things happen in the world. Tragedies, disasters, death happens in the world. I'm just helping. I'm just helping. And it's a real honor for me to go into people's lives in their worst moments and just help. Imagine You're standing by someone and they fall. They didn't fall because of you. People are going to fall. But you kneel down and give them a helping hand. That's my work. That's your work. We're not doing anything special. We're just kneeling down and helping. And
Oh, that's
people are
beautiful.
going to fall with or without us. I'd rather be there to help.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, I thank you so much on behalf of everybody at Griefline. And we look forward to talking with you hopefully in the future, and hopefully you coming out to Australia soon.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your wonderful work. I really appreciate it, as I know so many people do.